Welcome to lecture 15 of CSE 4635. In this lecture, we will be taking a look at DOM manipulation through JavaScript, and we will also be taking a brief look at JSON. So let's begin. So what exactly do we understand by DOM? DOM stands for Document Object Model. It is basically a structured representation of the entire HTML document, and the structured representation is basically a tree. So whenever you represent an HTML document in the form of a tree, we can consider each of the nodes or each of the elements in the HTML document as nodes or objects. So everything that is present in your HTML document, like the elements or the tags and even the content of the tags, they can be regarded as nodes and objects in the DOM tree. This DOM allows the manipulation of HTML elements and styles through JavaScript. So what that means is DOM gives us a list of functions or methods that we can use on those nodes and objects to manipulate them, which essentially means that we can modify them, change their content, and so on. We'll see more about that later on. So if you're wondering when the DOM is created, well, the DOM is essentially created whenever the browser loads the HTML document for the first time, okay? And that document is stored as a DOM tree, so basically as a tree structure. Each element in the HTML document is regarded as an object. So as I mentioned earlier, you can employ different functions and methods since all these elements are stored as objects in the DOM tree. So let's actually take a look at an example of an HTML document and the corresponding DOM tree to get a better understanding of how this whole thing works. Okay, so on the left-hand side here, we have a very simple HTML page, and it has some elements like the head tag and the body tag. Now, inside the head tag, we have a simple title element, and this title simply says simple page. Next, we have the body element, and inside the body element, we have an h1 tag that says DOM demonstration, and we have a section tag that is a section element that contains a paragraph element, and the content of that paragraph element is one-liner paragraph. Okay, so a very simple HTML file. Now, what happens when this HTML document is constructed as a DOM tree? Well, let's see. So what you need to remember is, in case of the document object model, every DOM starts with the document object at the very top. So this document object is a very special object that we can access in JavaScript, and by using this document object, we can essentially employ different methods or different functions on our HTML elements, which you will be seeing later on. Now remember, this document object acts as the entry point into the rest of the DOM. So now you see that the first element in this HTML file is the HTML element, right? So the first element that will be created in this DOM tree after the document object is the HTML node, okay, or the HTML object. Next, you can see that inside the HTML object or inside the HTML element, we have two sub-elements, the head and the body tag. So both of them will be created as well in the DOM tree, like so. After that, you will see that inside the head element, we have a title elements, right? So that title element will be created as well as a node in the DOM tree. Now, one important thing to note is that even the content of the title element, that is the text simple page here, will also be regarded as a node inside the DOM tree. So that will be created here as well. All right. So next, similar to how we have created the nodes for the head, title, and the simple page element inside the DOM tree, we will also have something similar happen in case of the body tag. So the body tag has two sub-elements called h1 and section elements, and these two elements have their own separate content as well. So the h1 tag says DOM demonstration, that is here, and that for those two elements, these two nodes have been created, right? Next, we have the section element, and since the section element contains another element called the p or the paragraph, that element has also been created here. And finally, since the content of the p element, that is the paragraph element, is one-liner paragraph, that text is also going to be regarded as a node in the DOM tree, and so it will get its own node as well. So essentially, after this whole entire tree has been generated by the browser, we can use the different methods that we spoke of earlier that are present inside DOM to manipulate these nodes. Now, since even the content of these elements, for example, this one-liner paragraph text or this DOM demonstration text, since this simple texts are also part of the DOM tree, we have the power to manipulate these texts as well. Okay. Now let's take a look at some of the key facts about DOM. So one of the misconceptions about DOM is that DOM is part of the JavaScript language. So that is not true. DOM is not part of the JavaScript language. DOM and its methods are part of something called the Web API. Now we already know that JavaScript is a part of the ECMA or ECMAScript specification, right? This DOM-related methods or the DOM-related functions are not part of the ECMAScript specification, okay? They are part of the Web API. Web APIs are essentially libraries which are written in JavaScript as well, and these libraries are implemented by the web browsers. And since these methods are implemented by the web browsers, we can access these elements or these functions and these methods through the JavaScript language inside our scripts. Browsers, that is all the modern browsers, implement an official DOM specification. Hence, DOM manipulation works the same across all browsers. So that basically guarantees that since DOM manipulation works the same across all browsers, as long as our coding practice is all right, as long as our coding logic is all right, the DOM manipulation will work the same across all browsers. So enough of the theoretical part. Now let's actually dive into the coding section and see how the things that we have discussed in our theoretical part actually work when they are implemented. So the first thing you should notice is we will be working with this very simple login page here. And this login page, that is the code snippet for this login page, has been taken from an online website. I will be linking that website in the video description. So let's take a look at the HTML file for now. So as you can see, our HTML file has the head tag and the body tag, and inside the head tag, we have defined the title of the page as login page. We have also we have also linked this HTML file to a specific style sheet, which defines the styles that we will be using to stylize this whole HTML document. So we'll be taking a look at the CSS file later on as well. For now, let's take a look at the HTML file first. So inside the body tag, as you can see, we have defined a division. Now this division is essentially, this division here is essentially this white box here. And this white box or this division holds the input field, the password field, that is the email field, the password field, and the login button, as well as this remember me on this computer text here. Okay, so in case you don't remember what division is, a division in an HTML document essentially defines a section in your HTML document, and creating divisions like this helps you in modularizing your whole HTML file and controlling or manipulating whichever part of your HTML file more easier. It basically makes the whole handling process much more easier. So anyway, we have another division here, and this division is essentially this text which says forgot your password, click here to reset it. Now again, if you don't remember, there are two special attributes that are constantly used in case of different HTML elements. So one of the attributes is class and the other attribute is ID. Now in case of class, multiple sections or multiple elements or multiple divisions in your HTML file can have the same class name. So in this case, this white box here has the class as login. Now if I wanted, I could have had another division or another element in my HTML document which had the same class as this, that is login class. Okay, so the other attribute that I talked about is the ID attribute. Now in case of ID attribute, you cannot repeat IDs for multiple elements or for multiple sections. So for example, in this case, this h1 tag has the ID welcome message, right? Now I cannot use the same ID, that is I cannot use welcome message as the ID for any other element. Okay, so that is what you need to remember in these cases. Now it is important for you to notice this classes and this class and this ID attributes, because these are the attributes that we will be using to actually access the elements in our HTML document through DOM. Okay, so just keep that in mind. And finally, at the end of the body tag, we have our script, and we have linked our HTML file to a script called practicescript.js. So we will be taking a look, or we will be doing our work inside that script file. So let's skip that for later. Let's take a look at the style sheet for now. Now, if you don't remember, in case of CSS files, we can modify or we can manipulate the styles of different elements in our HTML file by using different types of notations. So in case we want to modify an entire or stylize an entire element in our HTML document, we simply write down the name of that element like this. So this 3 lines here will be stylizing the whole entire body element, that is the entire content of the body element in our HTML file. Okay. Now, in case we want to stylize some specific class in our HTML document, we use the dot notation. So remember, we have a division in our HTML file here that has the class as login, right? So if we want to stylize this specific division here, we have to write dot login to mention that, or to specify that we are trying to stylize that login class, that division. Okay. Next, we have another notation, the hash notation, and this hash notation can be used to stylize some specific IDs, or to stylize elements with some specific IDs. So for example, if I write something like this, and I write down some specific lines of code here to stylize my email input, all that will happen is those stylizing elements will be implemented on my email input field here, okay? Because I have mentioned that the element that I am trying to stylize is the email field, and I am specifying that through this ID here, okay? So just remember that in case of CSS, whenever you are trying to stylize something, in case you want to stylize a class, you use the dot notation, and in case you want to stylize a specific element with a specific ID, then you use the hash notation, okay? So this is important as well, because we will be using the same notations as well in our DOM to access the different elements. All right, so let's move on to the script. Now, in case of this demonstration, we will be taking a look at 4 specific things. The first thing that we will be taking a look at is how we can actually select an element through DOM. Next, we will be taking a look at how we can modify the content of an element. Next, we will be taking a look at how we can handle different events, like how we can handle something like click events or hover events. So what happens when we click on something? So those are the things that we will be taking a look at in this section. And finally, we will be taking a look at how we can actually manipulate different CSS styles through DOM as well. Okay, so a couple of very interesting things to see here. So let's get started. Now remember when we said there is a very special object in DOM called document that acts as an entry point to the rest of the DOM? Well, turns out we will be using that very object to access our elements in the document or inside our HTML document. Okay, so to access an element inside our HTML document, we will write something like this: document.querySelector, and inside this query selector, we will pass a string that is the name of the selector, that is the name of the element that we're trying to select. So a couple of things to note here. This document is basically an implicit object that we can access through our JavaScript file, okay? And this document object has a number of very useful methods that we can use to manipulate different elements. So in case we want to select an element, all we have to do is write query selector, okay? And inside the parenthesis here, we will be writing down the name of the selector, that is, we will be writing down the name of the element. Now, remember in CSS, we use the dot notation to specify classes, and we use the hash notation to specify specific IDs, right? So suppose, let's head back to our login page here. Suppose we want to select this login to web app text here, that is, we want to select this h1 element here. Now this h1 element has an ID called welcome message, so we can use this ID to actually select this h1 element, okay? So let's go back to our practice script.js and write down hash welcome message, okay? Now by doing this, we have essentially selected our welcome message or our h1 tag there, okay? Now what if we want to actually select the text content of that h1 tag? That is, what if we want to actually select the text here? Well, that's very simple as well. We use another dot here and simply write text content. Okay, and there we have essentially selected the text content of our h1 tag that has the ID welcome message. Now we are specifying the ID here by using the hash notation. In case we wanted to select a division or a section with some specific class name, we would have had to use the dot notation. So we would have had to use dot, and then we would have had to use any of the classes that we have in our HTML file. So for example, take this for example. So the name of the class for this division is login help, right? So if we wanted to select this division, we would have had to write dot login help. Okay, but we will be working with the welcome message for now. Now suppose I want to actually print this text content in my console. So I can do that very easily by using console.log. And when I run this, let me actually save this. Yeah, and when we run this, you can see that we have gotten the text content that was actually present inside of that h1 tag, right? So that's how you can actually access different elements and different text content of different elements. Okay, now this is the way how you can actually select text content of simple text fields like this. But what about input fields like this? So in case you want to take the, or basically get the text that has been written inside this input fields, instead of writing text content, we have to write something called value. So at first, let's take a look at the IDs for the email field and the password field. So the ID for the email field is email input, and for the password field, it's password input. So if we want to actually get the text content of our email field and our password field, we have to write document.query selector. Here we will pass the name of the element that we're trying to access, so email input. And after that, instead of writing text content, we have to write value. Okay. Now, for now, this will not be giving us any value. Or if we actually print this on our console, you will see that we won't be getting any value because right now nothing has been written here, right? So let's actually run this. So you can see we get an empty line here. This empty line signifies that since nothing has been written inside this email field here, we are not actually getting anything. So anyway, next we have the modify. Next, let's take a look at how we can actually modify the content of an element. So again, in case you're wondering how we can access the content of this email field, we'll be taking a look at how we can handle events like pressing this button here and getting the content of that text inside this email field in the later sections of this video. So anyway, for now, let's take a look at how we can actually modify the content of an element. So suppose instead of having login to web app, I want some other text here. Okay, so suppose I want to write, haha, you have been fooled, right? So let's see how we can actually do that. So the first thing you want to do whenever you want to modify the content of an element is at first you have to select that element, right? So let's select that element for now by using our document.query selector method and specify that the element that we're accessing is the welcome message element. Now we want to change the text content of this element, right? So again, we have to write text content, and then all we have to do is equal to with whatever text we want to replace it with. So haha, you have been fooled. Okay, save this, refresh the page, and as you can see, we have modified the content of our original h1 tag to haha, you have been fooled. So essentially we have done some manipulation to our HTML page through DOM, right? So that is a big step. We have essentially learned how we can use DOM through JavaScript to manipulate the different elements and their content through our through DOM essentially. Yeah. So that's how we can actually change the content of our HTML document, right? So now let's take a look at something more interesting, which is how we can handle different events like click events or different other events that are present in when it comes to HTML web pages. So suppose we want to handle an event like something like this. So whenever we hit the login button here, the text that is present inside this email field will be printed on our console. Okay, so that's the kind of event that we're trying to handle. So since the event that we're trying to handle is linked or is connected to this login button here, we have to select this login button first, right? So let's head back to our login.html page and see what is the ID or what is the class that has been assigned to this login button. So, okay, the name of the login button, okay, the login button has a class called submit, okay? So we will be essentially using this submit class to handle different events that are linked to this login button, okay? So let's go ahead and do that. So first we will be selecting our login button by using the dot notation here, since we are selecting a class. It was submit, right? Yeah. So submit. And now that we have selected the element that we are trying to work with, we have to add something to this button or this element called event listener. So the purpose of an event listener is to listen for events like clicking on an element or doing something else to that element. So we have a special method for that called add event listener, and this add event listener will take as input the type of event that you're trying to handle. So in this case, we are trying to handle the click event, and after that we have to mention what exactly we want to do whenever that element is clicked, right? So the way we will be doing that is by specifying a function here, and for that we will be using function expression. So function expressions, as you can remember, can be written like this: parenthesis followed by the curly braces. So let's see again what we're doing here. We have at first selected the element that which we want to access, or basically the element to which we want to add an event listener, and then we have used the add event listener method to actually add an event listener to that element. And as for inputs to this add event listener method, we have at first specified the type of event which we are trying to add or which we are trying to handle, and then we have added a listener, which is essentially a function that specifies what will happen whenever that event happens, or whenever that click event is happening, right? So for writing the function here, we are using function expression. Okay, so as you remember, function expressions can be written by the function keyword followed by the parenthesis and then the curly braces. So what we want to do here is, as we have stated earlier, we want to print the content that is present inside this email field to our console whenever this login button is pressed, right? So for that, well, all we have to do is we have to print the content that is present inside the input field here, right? So for that, all we have to do is document.query selector. Inside here, we will be passing down the name of our email input. And remember, in case of input fields like this, we cannot use text content, we have to use value. Okay, so this is what we want to print in our console. So console.log, and here we simply pass what we had written earlier. Now let's save this. Let's comment these things out. And then let's refresh this page. Okay, so suppose I am writing something like this and I hit login. Now notice that something did actually come up here, but it disappeared instantly, right? So let's take a look at that again. I am writing something here, and whenever I press login, you can see that the text actually appears here, but it disappears instantly. So why is that happening? Well, the reason for that is we are using a submit type button here, right? And the purpose of the submit type button is to send the form information to some other servlet or some other kind of code which will handle that information, right? Or if no servlet or if no such program is specified, it will simply refresh the page. So since the whole page is being refreshed, our content that we had initially written inside our email field here is disappearing. So how do we tell the submit button to ignore that default event, right? So we have a function for that called prevent default. Okay, So we will be using that function to mention that, or to specify that the submit button should not refresh the page whenever this button is pressed. Okay, so this is just for demonstrating purposes. You would not usually use the prevent default function like this, or the prevent default method like this. So anyway, the way you can actually write this method is very simple. You have to pass a parameter to this function. You can name this parameter whatever you want. For example, let's just write test. And inside this function body, you have to write something like test.prevent default. So what will happen is this test variable, or this test variable will invoke the method called prevent default. And so whenever this button is pressed on this event, this whole page is not going to refresh, and we can actually see what is happening, or what is being written inside our email field here in our console. Okay, so let's try this again. Refresh the page. We've written something like this, hit login. And now, as you can see, we are actually getting the text content that we had written inside our email field here. Okay, so that's how we can handle click events. Now, this is, I have only showed you how to handle click events. You can mention whatever other event that you want to handle here. So there are a predefined list of events that you can handle. So you can just type in those events here and then write down a function here, which you can use to handle that event. Okay. Now it's not really essential that you have to write down the whole function expression inside the event listener like this. If you wanted, you could have defined the function expression earlier like this as well. So something like this, function, and there. So suppose you have written a function expression like this, and if you wanted, you could have replaced that function body with X like this, okay? And it will all work the same. So anyway, that's how you can handle events. Now, let's move on to our final section for this DOM manipulation section, which is how you can actually manipulate different CSS styles. So essentially, DOM manipulation can also help us in manipulating different CSS styles. So for example, for this demonstration, I will be showing you how we can actually change the background of this whole web page whenever we actually press this login button as well. Okay, so let's do that. Okay, so when it comes to manipulating the CSS styles, the first thing that you have to do, as you might have guessed, is you actually have to select the element whose style you're trying to manipulate. So suppose in this case, we are trying to change the entire background of this HTML body, right? So essentially, we will be modifying the whole body tag here. That is this whole part here, right? So that's the element that we will be selecting in our through our code here. So let's do that. Document.query selector. And here we will pass the name of the body tag. Now, since body is already an element that exists in our HTML file, and it is not a specific class, or it's not even an ID, all we have to do is we have to simply write down the name of the element here. So body. All right, so we have selected the body element. Now we want to specify that we want to change its style. And the way we can do that is by specifying the dot style property. Okay, so now what this means, what this entire line means, is we have selected the body element and we have selected its style. Now let's actually change the background color of this body tag, or this body element. And the way we can do that is simply by, again, writing dot, followed by the specific property of the body tag, or the body element that we want to manipulate. So background color. Okay. Now, one very interesting thing to note here is when it comes to this CSS properties like background color, whenever you will be trying to modify them through your style sheet file, some of the terms like background color, there are two words in this term, right? So in case of CSS, you will be writing something like this. So let me specify that here. You will be writing something like this. So you will be separating the two words with a dash, right? But when it comes to manipulating them through your JavaScript code, through DOM manipulation, you have to use camel case notation to actually specify the two words, okay? So anyway, suppose I want to set the background color to black. So here I will be using another string value, and I will be specifying the hexadecimal notation for the black color, which is 0000000. Okay. Now remember, whenever you are specifying styles like this, you have to write down the name of the specific units in case they're applicable as well. So for example, if I want to modify the width of this login box here, that is this email box here, I can do that as well. So something like this, dot query selector. Here I will pass the name of the email input, and then style, followed by width, then equals to. Then I can specify the width of of this email field, right? So suppose I want to change it to 20 pixels. So I will have to write something like this, 20 px. So remember, you have to specify the whole unit or unit of measurement or whatever that is needed to specify that style, okay? So anyway, let's head back to our background example again. So this is the line of code that I want to execute whenever this login button is pressed to change this background color from this light blue to black, okay? So you might have guessed already, we have to actually write this code inside this event handler here, right? So inside the event handler for this login button. So let's cut this and let's paste it here. Now let's save this, and whenever we actually press the login button here, we will see that the background of this web page is going to change to black. So let's see. So let's write something like this, hit login, and as you can see, the background color of our whole page has changed to black. Okay, so that is how we can actually manipulate the CSS styles of different elements as well. So these are the 4 things that I wanted to show you when it comes to DOM manipulation. Now you can obviously understand that there are countless number of things that you can do when it comes to DOM manipulation. But obviously, everything cannot be shown in our course. So I only showed you the very basic concepts so that you will be able to implement the rest of the things that you would maybe need in your project later on your own, okay? You can even do things like write an entire HTML file through your JavaScript code by using the document.write method. And inside this write method, you simply have to pass down or pass the text that you want to write to your HTML document. So for example, you can specify the tags, write down whatever you want, and so on. Okay, so yeah, we basically just scratched the surface when it comes to DOM manipulation, and I'm leaving the rest of the things to you guys to understand on your own and try to implement them on your own. Okay. So before ending our discussion today, I would like to talk a little bit about JSON. So JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. It is a lightweight, text-based open standard designed for a human-readable data interchange. What that essentially means is JSON is self-instructing, which means that it can easily be understood by anyone reading it, and since it contains data in a very well-structured format, it can easily be interpreted by any modern programming language, by like JavaScript, Java, C++, and so on. It is essentially an extension of the JavaScript language, as we shall see when we look at the syntax of JSON. It was originally specified by Douglas Crockford and is described in RFC 4627. Now let's take a look at some of the uses of JSON. So JSON format is used for serializing and transmitting structured data over network connection. So its use is kind of similar to XML because of the fact that both XML and JSON transfer structured data over the internet. So it is primarily used to transmit data between a server and web applications. Different web services and APIs use JSON format to provide public data. So the way you can think of it is like this. Suppose you are developing a web application that is going to show the current weather of some city that has been chosen by your client, and it's essentially going to show the weather information to the client. Now your web application at first has to get the weather data, right? It has to at first extract the weather data from some kind of server, and then it can show that data to the client. Now the format in which the weather server, that is the server that is running your web application, so the format that that server is going to use to actually send that weather information to your client is going to be in JSON format, and your client's web browser, for example, will actually parse that data and make it in or maybe just convert it into a more readable format for the client, right? And so essentially we can understand that JSON can be used to transfer data from server to client and so on. So most modern programming languages do support JSON actually. JSON supports the following data types. So it supports data types like number, string, boolean, array, value, object, whitespace, and null. Now let's take a look at the syntax of JSON. So JSON files have the .json extension, okay? And this is a very simple example of what a JSON file can look like. So a JSON file will start with curly braces, which indicates the root of the starting point of the JSON file, followed by your actual content. So in case of JSON, values are stored in key value pairs, or information is stored in key value pairs. So something similar to what you have seen when you have created objects in JavaScript. So as you can see, since we have already looked in the previous slide that JSON supports both arrays, objects, and so on kinds of data types. In this case, we can see that this specific JSON file is holding two arrays. One of the arrays is Pascal, and the other array is Scala. So the Pascal array holds two objects. One of the objects has the name Pascal Made Simple and price 700, and the other object has the name Guide to Pascal and price 400. The other array, Scala, has also two objects. The first object has the name of Scala for the impatient, and the price is 1000. And the second object has a name called Scala in depth, and the price is 1300. So we can see that this JSON file is essentially holding two array objects, and these array objects themselves have two other objects, right? So it is easily understood that, or the way we can actually interpret this is a very simple JSON file that contains information on two arrays, and those two arrays again contains two books, like this Pascal object contains two books, and the Scala object also contains two books. All right. So now you might be wondering, if the syntax between JSON objects and JavaScript objects are so similar, then what is exactly the difference between the two of them? Well, in case of JavaScript object, you don't really need to use quotation to surround the key names, right? So in case of JavaScript objects, we don't have to use double quotes to mention the key names, right? But in case of JSON files or JSON objects, you need to actually use double quotation to specify the keys or the names of your values. Also, in case of JavaScript objects, not JSON objects, in case of JavaScript objects, it is possible to include functions inside your JavaScript objects as well, right? But you can't really do something similar when it comes to JSON objects. Now, let's take a look at how we can actually access this JSON objects inside our JavaScript file. So suppose this is a very simple, suppose JavaScript file, and in this JavaScript file, we have created a JSON object as follows. So the same object that we have just seen in the previous slide, right? And now, as I have mentioned, this JSON object has two arrays, right? The Pascal array and the Scala array. Now, if you want to traverse through the elements of each of these arrays, we need two loops, right? Because there are two arrays. And the way we are accessing this first object, that is the Pascal object, is very simple. We simply wrote to JSON object.pascal, and since this is an array, we can use the .length property of the array, right? So we are essentially traversing through the elements of this Pascal array and just printing the information of that is stored inside this Pascal array, right? we did the same thing in case of the scalar object as well. So that is how we can actually use JSON, and this is very simple demonstration. You can obviously do some more complicated things when it comes to JSON objects and JavaScript objects and so on. So that's it for today's lecture. I have linked some of the sources that you can find useful, and if you are interested in into looking into more details into the concepts that we have studied today. So if you have any question, then let me know in our live class. I will try to answer them to the best of my abilities. So I will see you then. Take care and stay safe.